as part of the introduction I just said, I'm a historian of the environment and also a historian of science, and my interests in general are in sort of the development of ecological science and natural resource management. And I'm especially interested in how human activities of science and sort of knowledge making have taken place in environments and how they've related to the environments that people are studying. So it still is, there's a lot of scientists in my work, but I think it's also environmental history. So I'm going to skip that because you kind of covered that. I also want to try not to go too long, so I hopefully will not have to skip slides, but I might. So one of the reasons why I'm really interested in forests, besides just, it's a fascinating topic with a lot of really well-documented history, is because forests really bridge historical eras and political agendas, right? I mean, there can be a forest that has existed throughout, multiple changes of national boundaries and so on. The trees that have been planted in the forest during one political regime still exist, 2 or 3 political regimes later often. And so people are always living with the past when they're thinking about forest management. It's really a fascinating and complex kind of historical science, even when people don't want it to be, right? So forest history then, at its best, really complicates these notions of economic progress, scientific experiment. I mean, if an experiment takes 200 years to complete, it's kind of not a standard experiment, and environmental knowledge. So this is one of the reasons why I kind of keep circling back around to forests, even in my my new work. I couldn't shake the whole forest thing. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about. I thought I had a map here, but oh geez, I forgot to put the map slide in. Anyway, the Philippines is one of many archipelagos in Southeast Asia. I guess this map kind of hits the what I'm looking for, although it doesn't include everything. So this is the Philippines, right? And then there's what we now know as Taiwan and Japan. But there's sort of multiple archipelagos all over the place. And the Philippines itself is really one kind of distinct smaller archipelago within the larger kind of like framework, right, of all of these islands in Southeast Asia. And of course, it was a Spanish colony for several centuries, and the American presence there then begins with the Spanish-American War in 1898, and doesn't entirely end until the post-World War II era. And of course, we can argue that Ferdinand Marcos was kind of a reiteration of American presence as well, which is the political side we're probably not going to get into in this talk. But so the islands of Southeast Asia, to give a little bit of perspective then, were really a magnet for traveling European naturalist explorers in the 18th and 19th century. Most famously, of course, Alfred Russel Wallace traveled throughout the islands of Southeast Asia, mostly not the Philippines, but because the Philippines were Spanish, but throughout a lot of the other area, which is kind of off the left side of that map, and developed ideas of biogeography there. This is then the concept of small islands being kind of like a spark for the development of massive numbers of species. This comes out of this work that Alfred Russel Wallace did in the mid-19th century, that then, of course, in collaboration with Charles Darwin, becomes a sort of the underpinning for the theory of evolution by natural selection. The reason that I bring that up, besides the fact that it's kind of fascinating, is because the evolutionary history then of the Philippines, this kind of like extraordinarily long-term environmental history component, is also important to us because since it's made up of all these tiny little islands, there's a massive number of species in the forests in the Philippines. It's very different from the forests in Germany or in Canada or in a lot of temperate areas where the forest is really, the tree, the sort of tree level structure is really dominated by a couple of species. In a lot of island tropical forests, you can get just a massive number of different tree species that are all occurring with a fairly good regularity. So that's something that will become a real issue with forest management, so it's worth thinking about then. And it's also, of course, just to editorialize a little bit, it's why the challenge of conservation has been so serious on a lot of these small tropical islands, right? It's because a lot of them they just have very small populations of species to begin with, and so it's very unstable once there starts to be a lot of pressure on them. So this species diversity issue over the exceedingly long time frame of evolutionary history impacts events on the much shorter time frame of this kind of late 19th through mid 20th century forest management, as well as the forests become commodified. So then the other side of this kind of island geography is important also because of just this sort of reality of having a nation that's made up of a whole bunch of islands. When Spain comes there, and then when the United States comes there and tries to manage this, both of these nations have ideas of nationhood, of sort of like contiguous land masses, right? And it's much, much different to try to manage for economic benefit, manage natural resources for economic benefit when you're in a place where you just can't really kind of control all of the aspects of the landscape in the same way. So it becomes really a challenge, especially for the Americans, to deal with that. The issue of this kind of difficulty of considering an archipelago of islands as a kind of coherent nation state is, of course, most famously described in Benedict Anderson's work, right? Especially in the spectrum of comparisons, but also in imagined communities. So I'm sure this will resonate for a lot of people because of that. So it becomes a really unique setting for thinking about economics and thinking about political control as well. So then Westerners then have encountered the Philippines as places of both ecological and economic importance since the late 16th century when Magellan arrived in the Philippines and was pretty quickly murdered. And the particular geographical challenges then of the Philippines govern the economic approaches that different nations have had, both sort of external colonial powers and then, of course, self-government as well. So let's see, and then go back. So talk a little bit about the Spanish era, just really briefly, because it's not really my focus. But so, in the Spanish era, this is a Manila galleon, right? This is one of the most famous aspects of Spain's sort of control for going from Asia to Central America. The Manila galleons were responsible for sort of like maintaining a lot of Spain's wealth around the world. And within the context that we're talking about, right, within forests, the importance is, of course, that you need a lot of wood to maintain a really strong navy up until the mid-19th century. So the forest management in the Philippines during the 17th, 18th, 19th century, if anything is being done to manage the forest, it's being done most specifically to kind of make sure that there is wood available there. And a lot of the Manila galleons then were actually partially built with wood from the Philippines, different species, and the forests were managed for kind of like maximizing particular kinds of wood availability, but also, and then this is important, this political control thing, because I think this is one of the things I think is so fascinating about colonial forestry in general, is that when you have got an external power like Spain or the United States coming in and claiming that they are controlling a particular landscape, a particular set of islands, it's very easy for people to reject the colonial rule, right? And so one of the ways that they actually assert their power over the landscape, not just over the people, but over the actual landscape, is to reorder the forest, to cut down certain sections of the forest and to replant things. And so one of the main things that Spain tried to do was to create teak plantations. This teak was a very valuable wood that is not actually native to most of the Philippines. But they would try to establish teak plantations and not, as you would think you would, if you really just wanted teak, you would put them in areas that were easy to access and easy to control. control. But no, what they did was they would put the teak plantations in the most restive and most problematic parts of the Philippines, the places where they're having the most trouble with insurgents. They would go in and cut down natural forests and say, now this is a teak plantation and stay out. It's no longer a forest that you can use. So this is the landscape that the United States comes into, and they really continue a lot of this kind of a technique of managing forests for political control as well as for wood. So this is the treaty that ends the Spanish-American War. This is one of these maps when people are very excited. American business people are very excited about the potential of having the Philippines as a kind of jumping off point for Asian business. It is I'm not going to get into a lot of the kind of diplomatic history, and I'm also not going to really get into the military history. We can suffice to say it was an incredibly brutal military situation, both in the Spanish-American War and after. There's a lot more that could be said on that. But, so this is another one of these maps. As you can see, this is from Harper's Weekly in 1900, published by the Republican National Committee. You can see where their interest is. This is the Manila at the center, and then showing how easily the rest of Asia can be reached from establishing an industrial outpost of your company in Manila. So this is kind of where the United States is coming from in general with their work in the Philippines. So what I want to do now for the rest of this talk is to go through some of the tasks that forestry as a profession, sort of like forest management, had in the Philippines within this context, right, of being this kind of like newly established colonial power after the Spanish. And so one of the things, of course, that's the most important for American goals is to continue the control of forest lands and also to remove insurgents. And actually, of course, Spain had not been very successful, and then during the course of about 15 years of kind of unrest and chaos, there had been a lot of changes. A lot of people had sort of taken back land that had previously been better controlled by Spain. And so Americans then had to, if they wanted to control the Philippines, they had to have some control over the entire landscape. And this is affected by the fact then that the nation, or the Philippines, as a part of the American, progressive era colonial reach, is actually in the beginning, for the first couple decades, it does not have its own kind of self-governance at all. It has a government that is actually the U.S. Army. It's a part of the U.S. Army that has kind of been developed and established and sort of like created out of whole cloth, mainly sort of specifically tailored to the Philippines in order to create a sort of semi-military, semi-civilian governance of the islands. So this then is the kind of challenge that this means that all of the kind of leadership within every department of the insular government, of the American insular government, has to be a military one. And so they need to find somebody who is an army officer who can also run the forestry department. And there's it's a very small pool of choices that they have. And this is the guy who gets the job, right? So this is this guy, Captain Ahern. He's a fascinating character. He's actually the way that I kind of started getting into this is that he later on in his life he writes some books. Once he retires, he writes some books that are kind of conservation, like theory, kind of over the top forest conservation stuff in the 1930s and 1920s. But during this time, so this is earlier on in his career than that, he
is appointed to be the head of forestry in the Philippines. Now, interestingly, he doesn't actually have any background, any scientific background, right? And this is one of these questions where it becomes unclear, like how much is forest management about kind of like a biological understanding of how forests work and sort of an understanding of like the intricacies of kind of like the resilience of forests when people are extracting wood out of them, and how much is it really about just kind of like controlling landscapes and you know, maximizing financial benefit and sort of like ensuring that the loggers can have access and so on. For Ahern, he was very, very interested in the scientific side of things, despite the fact that he didn't have any background in it. He had started his career in the Army as an officer in the Indian Wars, and like so many people of his generation, so many people who ended up in high-ranking positions during the Spanish-American War had started out in the Indian Wars in the American Plains. And he goes then from that into a position as an ROTC recruiter in Montana, where he ends up kind of, for no particular reason that I can tell, he ends up getting hired to teach forestry at the University of Montana, and so he ends up being put into this position of authority in forestry without actually having the training in it, and he's sort of self-taught in the field. And then he gets injured in the Spanish-American War. He goes back into active duty and is injured. Does not want to be, you know, have to go get a civilian job. So manages to pull some strings and get this essentially a desk job in the Philippines. So he's a very interesting character, and he's put into a position where he has got the military side of things, where he has to control all of these forest landscapes that a lot of people are living in the Philippines. A lot of people are using for agricultural use and hunting in and developing towns in and so on. And he also, at the same time, needs to cater to those American businessmen who are looking at the Philippines as a potential place where they can benefit a lot financially. So this is, and to give you an idea sort of what the Americans were working with. This is a picture of this famous road to Baguio. Sorry, there's a couple of people here from the Philippines, and I apologize for all my pronunciation, but it's not actually pronounced Baguio. But it's this little mountain station town in the Highlands in Luzon. And this is a picture of this road, and the reason I bring this in here, this is from a tourist pamphlet, but because you can see it's already totally deforested, right? This is already like a very barren landscape where there's probably some agriculture going on, but it's not the original forest anymore, right? And so this is kind of like this aspect of control where it's like, well, okay, if you're going to have like a road where tourists are going up into this, you know, this mountain area, and then Baguio had this kind of, it was kind of like the outpost of the military headquarters in the Philippines. You don't want to have the opportunity for people to kind of attack on the road, so like, let's get rid of all the trees. So this is a kind of an example of the way that logging gets involved in military control here. And this, a lot of this logging in the mountainous inland areas of the bigger islands in the Philippines had been started with the Spanish, but it was really, really stepped up by the Americans. So then this then gets you to the point where you're sort of controlling the population by imposing this new environmental reality. So then the second one is, that I want to talk about here, is overhauling the extant Spanish-era logging infrastructure. So I've been talking some about forests and the kind of like transformation of forests. At the same time, you can't just like have logs. You have to have this whole infrastructure to extract felled trees out of the forest and to sort of prepare them at least to the level where you can sell them overseas as sort of like rough hewn logs, if not actually prepared timber. And then at the same time, there's this whole question of these timber tree plantations that had been often just like extremely poorly managed by the Spanish, and were in some of them were in such disrepair that they were essentially abandoned during the American era. And so this is the second issue that then Ahern has to deal with. And he realizes he's a little overmatched with this, and he brings in the big guns, right? He brings in different Pinchot, who is, of course, the originator of this sort of American idea of forest conservation as being a program for management for long-term, steady economic benefit from forests and other natural resources, right? Pinchot, of course, has a lot of different aspects of his legacy, but this is in 1902. That's mostly what people had known him for. So he is invited. He's Pinchot and Taft, who later becomes president of the United States, was at the time Governor General of the Philippines. Pinchot and Taft are both skull and bones Yale men, and so they kind of know each other. Along with a lot of these conservation people of this era, where it's a sort of like shadow thing. But so Pinchot is like going to do Taft a favor, so comes over to the Philippines. Also, just wants a free trip to the Philippines. Who doesn't really? And comes over on sort of like a consultation and takes a tour of the islands. And again, what's really interesting is you can see in Pinchot's diaries that exactly where they went on the tour, and they hit all of the spots that were kind of most problematic militarily, which is really fascinating. And they didn't necessarily go to the parts of the country that were of particular biological interest or of particular potential for economic benefit, but instead they went to the places that were trouble spots. So they go to parts of Mindanao that had seen a lot of fighting very late into the conflict, the Philippine-American War. And then they go down to this, the southern islands of the Sulu archipelago, which I want to go back and show you this because I think it's so interesting. So this is these islands, the Sulu Islands, and as you can see in this map, they're actually being designated as separate, as not even a part. Like here's the Philippines and here's the Sulu Islands. But the Sulu Islands are considered to be a part of the Philippines kind of politically. It's a very interesting and very kind of like rebellious area, and it has been so for a very long time. And they actually go there on this trip, right? So it's clear that the interest is not simply in how can we make the most money off of the Philippine forest, but also how can we manage these forests in order to assert American control over these landscapes. And so they develop, with Pinchot's help, they develop plans for kind of modernizing some of the sawmills, instituting kind of forestry camps in certain areas, and working kind of like half military and half logging programs into a lot of the Philippine islands. At the same time, of course, Pinchot is fascinated by the ecology, and it's just kind of like the basic tropical forest ecology that he sees. And he comes back to Manila after this tour, and they're on an armed yacht for this, and gives a whole bunch of ideas to Taft and to Ahern about what things should happen for creating kind of a stable future for the Philippines. The reason why I say an uncertain future is that, of course, the United States had gone into the Philippines stating that they did not want it to be a permanent colony, right? That they were there just temporarily. And this kind of underpins a lot of the way that people in the Philippines are thinking, or the way that Americans in the Philippines are thinking about management, because they have from the beginning said, we're here for a while, then it's going to be a commonwealth of the United States, and then it's going to be totally handed over as an independent nation, which means that in general, people are not investing a whole lot of intellectual capital from the United States into the Philippines. It's different than, for example, Dutch Java, where a lot of the big brains from the Netherlands wanted to go to Java to sort of make their careers. Here it's everyone kind of realized that it was semi-temporary, and the payments and so on were not very good. So it's always in this kind of uncertainty, when is things going to get handed over, when is it going to become under Philippine control instead of under American control. But at the same time, that's the progressive era. They want to make everything as American as possible before they do leave. So then this is, I don't want to take too long. So this is the third of these tasks that I am outlining here, is based on this. to sort of rescale American natural resource conservation philosophy to fit Asian tropical forests. This is incredibly difficult to do. For one thing, as I was saying in the beginning, I mean, just the entire environmental realities of the Philippines are so different from most of the area that Americans were really interested in the United States, of these kind of like vast swaths of western, mountainous forests where there's like a lot of these, especially the kind of like the upper part of the Rocky Mountains. There's not a whole lot of species diversity. I mean, they're lovely forests, and I'm not trying to criticize them, but they certainly don't have nearly as many species of actual tree, as a tropical forest does. And of course, there's this whole issue of transportation and log extraction, where it just becomes a completely different problem. You cannot build a railroad across the Philippines and have every community on the sides of the railroad benefit from it the way you can in the American West, right? Where it's just a completely different system of extracting resources from the area. However, this is the project that they have, is to try to figure out how to do this. In order to have that work, though, they realize, and Pinchot was very clear about this, and Ahern also understands this, that they cannot do anything until they have better basic biological understanding of the forest. There's a lot of problems in the fact that, or it's a challenge in the fact that there's many languages in the Philippines, and each one of the islands often has a different word for different trees, right? And so there's sometimes there'll be like a word that is used for a tree that is not clear that it's the same tree in an island that's 500 miles away, because you don't have this. There's not this kind of like standardization of the species yet in the Philippines, and also sometimes the tree just looks different when it's growing at different latitudes and so on. And sometimes there would be the same word would be used for several species of tree. Be like, well, this tree, we use these trees for X purpose, and then actually there's like 3 or 4 kinds of tree. But it takes a long time to kind of translate a lot of the local knowledge of Philippine forests and the Spanish knowledge of Philippine forests into something that is legible for American scientists, right? This is the kind of like a stopping point between the two cultures for the sort of development of this stuff. And so there's some projects that they take on, right, in order to develop this. And one of them, then, is the Philippine School of Forestry. It's begun by Americans in 1910. This building actually was built in 1930, but it's part of this bigger project of progressive education and so on. Is to sort of like found all of these institutions of higher learning in the Philippines. In the case of forestry, what's really interesting is that they have got sort of this dual role. On the one hand, they want to create a body of biological knowledge of kind of like exactly what's going on in these forests, exactly what's there. But at the same time, they want to train rangers, they want to train Filipinos to be the people who go out into the forest and evict the people who are not supposed to be there, and to enforce the laws against slash and burn agriculture, which has been a big problem for the Americans during this time. So they don't want, like, if an American goes in and tries to evict agriculturalists from the forest, it's a military conflict, right? Because all of the Americans who are going to do this are like members of the U.S. Army. If a Filipino who's trained as a ranger goes in and does it, it's more of a friendly encounter, one would hope. And so this is the other side of this. That it's not simply about creating knowledge, it's also about sort of like instilling these values of American forest use amongst the Filipinos, and also creating this kind of like set of deputies to the American project, who are themselves Filipinos, and who will then, hopefully, once the handover takes place and Filipinos are in control, will sort of like continue. This is the goal of course, all of the Americans, is that the Filipinos will just sort of like perpetuate a lot of the American programs. And actually, in fact, one of the people who gets trained very early on as a ranger from this school, then does become known. He becomes the head of forestry in the Commonwealth era, and in the post-World War II era, he becomes this fairly famous guy, Florencio Tunisis, who becomes known as the father of Philippine forestry. So this, I mean, it is an effective program that they've done to sort of like force the American project to take root. And so then this is the last, right, of the ones that I want to talk about, is this creating a management framework to ensure a future of steady logging profits. And this is a really complex side of things, is because, I'm gonna like, a little bit more time, right? And so there's, it's hard to sell it's not hard to sell anything to people who don't know they want it, right? And this is the trick of marketing, right? Is to explain to potential consumers why they want what you have to buy. With the situation with wood, of course, if you have a species that has not previously been on the market, it's very difficult to get people to trust that it's a good wood, that they should make like their cabins or their house or whatever out of this kind of wood. So in the Philippines, because all these species are very local and endemic species, they're not well known at all. There had been like a fairly good amount of sale to Japan, which is one of the reasons, of course, that Japan is so eager to get into the Philippines during World War II. But the fact is that in the United States, nobody knew anything about these woods, and no one was going to use them because of that. So there's this problem that comes out of it, right, is that if you want to do marketing, you have to have a good name for the wood, and you have to explain to people in the U.S. why they should want it, because this is they're hoping that this is the big market. And so the trick then is that Ahern and others, this is prepared by Captain George Ahern and along with a bunch of other people, is they create this kind of handbook about the timber trees, and within it, for each page, there's like a kind of tree, and then like here's all of the names that people have called this tree by. Here's the scientific name. Here's what the Americans call this tree, and then there's like a whole bunch of information about like how the tree could be used, what kind of wood it comes from it, how much wood can be gotten from a single tree, like whether there's other benefits to it, whether the flowers are pretty and all that stuff. But it's mostly to kind of like help the industry to get going. And so then this is the end, and this is why I've been so obsessed with these motorboats for the last few weeks, and I really love this. So this is the story of this so-called Philippine Mahogany, and because I'm kind of running out of time, I seem to leave it. This is going to be the last part of the story that I tell you. But so the Philippine Mahogany is this interesting marketing tool. Mahogany, of course, is a New World tree. It is found in the Caribbean, and it's found in Central South America, right? And so there's like a couple species, and they are all New World species, and they become incredibly important and very, very highly prized woods for making cabinetry out of, and it becomes, this kind of like big trend in the 19th century to have mahogany furniture and so on. And these really sneaky wood merchants realize that they cannot sell a tree in the United States. They can't sell wood called Lauan, which is not something that anyone knows about. And so what they do is they rename about 5 or 6 different species of tree that are found in the Philippines and have similar characteristics. They rename this whole set of trees Philippine Mahogany, and they start selling trees. So it's not even just one species that they've renamed. It's just like a variety of species that all they think might be good for making furniture out of. They sell all of these under the name Philippine Mahogany in the United States. It's very controversial, and there's an FTC case about this in the 1920s. However, what really changes the game is that then Chris Craft, which is, if you know anything about Midwest motorboat, it's this culture of these little motorboats becomes really big in the 1930s, and then again after World War II. Extremely beautiful little wooden boats, and they become marketed as being made with real Philippine mahogany planking. And this becomes so popular, these boats become so popular, that in fact it ends up tremendously impacting the availability of all of these species that are termed Philippine mahogany. It's mostly this red Lauan, but there's a couple other species that also really get detrimentally affected by it. And by the time that Chris Craft and other motorboat manufacturers switched to fiberglass, they're doing it mostly because they cannot get any more of this Philippine mahogany, and it still is a species that's in a threatened state because of this, one set of uses that becomes so popular. So now you cannot, and there's all these small like vintage boat internet forums where people are trying to find Philippine mahogany to restore their boats, and they cannot find it, which is it's fascinating as a historian to read this stuff. But anyway, this is so this is kind of like the way that this all plays out. And then I'm gonna skip over some of this stuff, and I want to just like end up, Jesus, just in case, talking about the independence era, just so you guys know a little bit of kind of like where things go from this. So this is a graph, right, of this kind of era. So I want to make sure people realize that during the time I'm talking about, despite all of this attempt to create this infrastructure for use, they actually don't have a whole lot of impact on the forest. And this is, they don't actually like cause too much deforestation. But what happens is that all the stuff that gets founded, the sawmills, the forest school, the idea of the particular woods that can be sold overseas, all of that kind of infrastructure that's built by the Americans, then creates this kind of like potential during the independence era to really affect the availability of some of this wood. And so you can see here that it's after World War II, right, that a lot of the change occurs. So it's the total forest cover suddenly drops off. The availability of primary old growth. I mean, some of these the figures are a little hand waving here, but you can see it goes down to almost zero at this point. And then timber production increases dramatically, and that's not even including wood that's smuggled out, which doesn't make it into this, which is would make it even higher because there's a lot of smuggling of wood during, especially in the 1970s, out of the Philippines up to Japan. So that is, I think I'm going to just leave it at this. So I'll just say thank you, thanks, and that's all I have.